Hey copycat quilters, welcome back to my channel. I have to admit, I love watching Fabric Cafe's videos. They're the 3-yard quilt guys. I really enjoy it because the copycat nature in me wants to look at those blocks, figure out how to make them, what the measurements are, so that I could make one myself without using the pattern. But being respectful of people's copyrights and really respecting the designer's efforts that go into it, I would never show you how to do that on my channel. I did decide that I wanted to try one of those quilts. So I actually bought the book and I decided I was going to make the one called Elemental. Now, knowing me, I couldn't make it the way the instructions said, so I decided to see, can you scrap a 3-yard quilt? Before we get into that, I wanted to let you know about the absolutely free Conquering Your Fabric Scraps Summit. It's open for registration now. If you follow the link below in the description, you can get registered for this free event. It is 4 days of presentations and projects and patterns, jam-packed from over 20 quilting educators. Absolutely free. If you follow the link below, you can register. Now you will get the chance to also purchase a bundle package on top of it at a very affordable price that gives you even more ideas in scrap management and scrap use and turning scraps into quilts. It includes free patterns and projects and even more presentations. That part's totally optional, but you absolutely don't want to miss the free event. So click below and get your registration now so you're ready when the event opens up. Now back to the quilt. So I used the Elemental pattern out of their Make It Easy 3-Yard Quilts book. I chose that pattern because unlike some of their others, it has a lot smaller pieces and didn't require I have like a 10-inch block of something or an 8-inch block of something. So I decided to use that pattern to try it out with scraps. First, I had to pick out my color scheme and the idea that I had for the quilt. So I chose to do purple, green, and white, or purple, green, and cream, and assign those into the fabric 1, 2, and 3 categories, like all of their quilts have. Then I just went to my stash and pulled out things that looked harmonious. So my greens ended up a little more teal green than just like Kelly green, and I tried to stay with darker purples so I could get that contrast that their quilts require. So one thing that makes their quilts so efficient and fast is they depend a lot on strips and strip sets. Now I have a lot of leftover jelly roll strips, 2.5 inches, but the strips in their quilts are different sizes. I mean, some of them are 2.5-inch strips, but some are 1.5, some were 3. So I kind of struggled trying to figure out how I could do strip sets with small pieces of scraps. I decided to take scraps that I had. So like I had some charm squares and I sewed those charm squares together into a long strip and then cut my strip sets from that. So you can see my strips are pieced together. And then I took those smaller sections that I created and sewed them onto some of the fabrics that I did have longer strips for. So like for my background fabric, I had some off-white and kind of flesh tone colored layer cake pieces left over. And I sewed those down one side and then cut my strips from that at the size that I needed. So out of 2 layer cake pieces put together, I could get a 20-inch strip by the size that I needed. And then I took the smaller strips that I had created from my scraps and sewed those piecemeal onto those bigger straps and then subcut them into the sizes I needed. The book instructions instruct you to cut all of your strips first out of width of fabric, and then some of them cut into smaller units. Since I didn't have width of fabric scraps, that wouldn't really work for me. And when my brain sees things like make 24 of these units, it just goes, no way. So by making individual units and subcutting, it was faster for me, and it also let me use smaller scraps. So I could cut a unit out of a strip set I put together that was say 3.5 by 6.5 inches. And if I could only get 2 of those out of the strips I had, then that was fine. I even pieced together some of the smaller strips that I had into slabs to cut into the squares that were needed for this quilt. So you could even use crumb quilting stuff in there if you wanted to. But I took things where I had multiple strips, I sewed them together and then trimmed it into the square size I needed for that block. So of course I goofed up. Who doesn't? For about 6 of the blocks, for one of the sides where I needed a strip, I cut it a 1/2 inch too narrow. So instead of, if it was supposed to be 2, I cut it 1.5. I had already sewed this on to about 10 blocks before I realized it was too skinny. Now, I'm not a big fan of seam ripping, and this is a scrappy quilt anyway, so I just took a little bit and trimmed off to make it even narrower so that whenever I sewed another strip to it, it wouldn't be in my new seam allowance. So I took a wider strip, sewed it along that strip, pressed it open, and then trimmed it to the right size so it ended up with the blocks the size that I needed, and I didn't have to seam rip that old strip off or not use a strip that I had already cut. I just needed it to be wider. Once I had all of the components made, it was time to put those together into units and build my blocks, and then put those blocks into the quilt. Now these quilts are really fast and time efficient, but having to piece together those scraps and everything and kind of basically make up my own strips took more time than it would if you were cutting the big strips. But you know, I wanted to challenge myself to use scraps, and I did. And this is my result. After following all those instructions for the cutting and the piecing, I couldn't follow any more instructions about borders, and I didn't have enough fabric to make solid piece borders. So I just added on a border of my lighter background color and called it a day. So did I scrap a 3-yard quilt? Yes, I did. Is it a success? I guess that depends on how you measure success. It does not look like their quilt. I mean, it's similar to it, but because I used the scrappy fabrics, you lose some of the repetitiveness and maybe the graphic nature of the quilt. But I think it turned out pretty. It's a nice little scrap quilt. It was fun to make, and I used up some scraps. Even though I'm convinced my scrap pile looks bigger now than it did when I started. Would I do it again? Probably not, but I might if I'm trying to make a quick charity quilt and I use fabric yardage that I have in my stash. You know, for this scrappy version, I did not buy a thread of fabric. I only used scrap, but I have yardage in my stash too. So I would try it again with yardage where I can cut those big strips, but I don't know that I would try to scrap it again. So being the copycat quilter, if I did try it again, I would probably first use yardage that I have in my stash because I do have 1-yard cuts. I would also probably play around with the measurements some and try to get the strip sets into strip sizes that I have AccuQuilt dies for. After having AccuQuilt, I do not enjoy rotary cutting, and apparently I've gotten worse at it because I can't cut sizes and shapes anymore. But I have a lot of strips, dies of different sizes, so I would probably try to make the measurements fit into some of those strip dies. Now, of course, if I do that, I'll show you the quilt I made, but I won't give you any of the measurements or anything because, again, I respect their pattern and their copyright. So if you want to do that, you need to get the book and you need to figure out those measurements for yourself. Now, a couple of things about their patterns. I'm not a pattern follower normally, but these patterns are really well written. They provide the written instructions about the cutting and tell you how to do the cutting and what strip sizes to do. And then there's a lot of words about how to assemble them. I get lost in those words, but they also have some pictures of the strip assembly. And it tells you, okay, sew together these 3 strips and you need to end up with a strip set that is 3.5 by 6.5. I can do that. I'm much more of a visual picture learner. So I really appreciate that they have the written instructions for people who prefer to learn that way. And then they also have those pictures with a little bit of a number on it so I can follow that instead of all of the written words. One other thing, since their pattern really is made to be efficient using yardage and using with the fabric strips, it's not as easily translatable, or you lose some of the efficiency if you try to make it scrappy, unless you just happen to have some width of fabric strips that are the sizes that are required. One last thing about trying to scrap up the 3-yard quilt is you'll probably lose some of the look or the feel of their quilts. You know, some of them almost look like optical illusions, and unless you choose your fabric scraps to be very, very similar in the coloring and, you know, their value, are they dark, medium, or lights, and it ends up kind of reading as the same fabric, you'll probably lose some of that graphic, optical illusion kind of effects that their quilts are known for. But don't let that stop you. This is the first book or pattern that I've gotten from them. I was very impressed with the instructions and the pictures and the illustrations, how detailed they are. And their quilts are cute and they're pretty. And if you do the strip version, they're super fast from what I hear. I can see why those 3-yard quilts are so popular with quilters. Now before I go, let me remind you again, go to the description below, click through the link, and get your free registration for the Conquering Your Fabric Scraps Summit. I know a lot of us copycat quilters and just quilters in general love scraps, have tons of them, and want to turn them into quilts. And you will get so many ideas and so much information from this free summit. Don't miss it. You'll love it. So thanks for watching. I hope you come back again, and good luck with your 3-yard quilts or scrap quilts or whatever your next project is.